our responses to the geopolitical impacts. That's on the case of Australian university. And as most of you know, and higher education, especially international higher education around the world, has been increasingly affected by multiple factors, including marketization, of course, and AI, and the shifting geopolitics. Here we are also doing a project funded by the JSPS, which is stands for Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. We're very interested in your topic and want to learn from your case study. So, and this open seminar will take for 1 hour and 30 minutes. And first, we would be very happy to invite Chris to come here to talk for about 1 hour, followed by Q&A. So let's welcome Professor Chris Zigras to give his talk. Thanks for that.
All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity to present here. This is the first time I'm visiting the centre, and I've known of this centre for a very long time. And the centre that I'm involved in Melbourne has had an agreement, a partnership with this research centre for 20 years now. So I'm really glad to be able to visit and meet you all. And so my background is I'm a political scientist by training, and I've been working for the last nearly 30 years on research on higher education, but with a focus on internationalization, globalization of higher education systems, and really the interaction between governments, institutions, and markets and student demand, students and other providers. And so looking at many different aspects of that. So I hope this presentation today is useful. And you'll see that in many ways, Australia and Japan are in similar situations geopolitically. And so I'm hoping there's some parallels between, your experiences and your observations about Japan and what's happening, what I'm describing about Australia. It's going to be quite I'm going to talk in a fairly conceptual way, but talking about what's happened in practice. Not a theoretical talk today, but very practical, sharing an analysis of what's happened and why, and what the debates are in Australia. Now, okay, and if anyone has any questions or clarification, things that aren't clear while I'm presenting, please just ask, and quite happy to engage then. But we'll also have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. All right. And so in a nutshell, before I start, Australia was one of the most successful countries in the world at adapting its higher education system to the emergence of a global market, right? When students started traveling in bigger numbers from the 1980s, mid-1980s. And that success influenced everything about the Australian education system. And Australia kind of became known for that. And more recently, other countries, Canada and so on, have done something similar. That was very successful, but in a new era where globalization is a much more tense global environment and a more politicized global environment, that openness is now a challenge for Australia. And so what was a strength is now being seen as a limitation, a liability or weakness, vulnerability in Australia. So I'll talk about that change over time. Okay. Now, okay. Is it possible to get rid of that little window at the top? This one? Oh, yeah, just like that. Good. Okay, that's better. All right, so the four sections of my talk today. First, I'll talk about that global integration, the market era, or neoliberal era, sometimes people describe it as. So from the mid-1980s, 1990s until maybe 2010, yeah. I'll talk about that phase a little bit. Then I'll talk about three different types of concerns. The first is trade exposure, the degree of international trade that the sector is involved with, and the vulnerabilities of that international trade. Secondly, national security concerns, which I think we're focused on today. And then thirdly, uncontrolled growth, right? Concerns about scale of immigration, right? They're three different issues, and they interplay with each other quite significantly. And I don't think we can understand one without the other. So I'll talk about those three different concerns and then try to explain where we are now in Australia and how those different concerns are being dealt with by policy, both government policy and institutional strategy by university. Okay, so firstly, the global integration. So from the 80s, Australia adopted a regulatory framework and institutional strategies that allowed it to successfully engage. Yeah, we've talked about. So this was not accidental, and it wasn't driven initially by the universities themselves. This was quite an active decision by governments to create a set of policy conditions which would steer the institutions in a particular direction, right? It would encourage the universities to do certain things, yeah? And it worked quite well. So the first thing they did in the mid-1980s is they deregulated student fees. Before that, international students paid the same fees as domestic students. And so they received a government subsidy in the same way as domestic students did. The government didn't want to pay for too many international students, so it limited international students at something like 10% of enrollments. Yeah? So some universities had international students, but smaller numbers. It became apparent that there was way more students wanted to study in Australia than that, and that there was a capacity for those students to fund their own study. So the government withdrew funding for international students, said to the universities, you can charge the fees that you like, you can enroll as many international students as you like. So that really was the biggest change they made. And so for the universities, you have the number of domestic students is constrained, is limited by the government. They will fund, for my university, let's say 40,000 undergraduate places. That's all. And the university can't grow except if the government agrees to have 41,000, 42. There's limited capacity for entrepreneurial innovation, growth, etc. Whereas for international student recruitment, the universities could recruit students and decide how much to charge, and they would increase their revenues, increase their student numbers, but also have some discretionary income, some additional income that they could use on other things, new buildings, invest in research, and so on. They may not have that discretionary income, although from domestic students. And so international student growth became one way for the universities to develop in interesting ways. Yeah? So that made a big difference, that simple change to the tuition fee regime. Then all of the other elements that we think of now of an effective and efficient policy framework to recruit students were put in place quite early in Australia. These features became common to all of the main destination countries, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US, more or less, and probably most of these things in Japan also at various times. So having a student visa system that's fairly easy to apply for, online applications and so on, and the Australian visa system was pretty quick and fairly cheap. There was consumer protection for international students so that if they paid their fees to a small college, if the college didn't teach them well, they could apply to have their fees refunded. If the college went broke and closed, they would be guaranteed education at another college, right? Like an insurance scheme. So there was various, and government made sure that there was a registration process for colleges so that in order to take international students, you had to meet all sorts of standards, yeah? Because there was a possibility for exploitation of students then. There's quality assurance regimes, government-to-government coordination, so the Australian government making deals with other governments for recognise each other's qualifications, cooperation agreements, and so on. If Australian universities wanted to set up campuses in Malaysia or Singapore or partnerships, the Australian government would help. They would talk to their counterpart, to the other Ministry of Education. The government would help universities to do international business, really. It was seen as a good thing for Australia for the universities to be going up. Post-study work rights were introduced so that graduates could stay for an extra 2 years with full work rights in the countries, master's students for 3 years. So that made a study in Australia way more attractive if you could, because Australia is an expensive country to study in and to live in, but the wages are quite high compared with where the students are coming from. So if you can work after graduation, that makes a big difference, yeah? And also pathways to permanent migration. We think that around 35 to 40% of international students in Australia stay permanently, right? So that's a very large number of students. Australia's had an active immigration program for a long time, for its whole history, really. Australia's always received migrants. And since the 1990s, the migration program has been focused on skilled migrants. So migrants with high levels of English and qualifications which are recognised in Australia, right? Professional qualifications. So the average income of immigrants in Australia is higher than the domestic population, right? The average educational qualifications of migrants is higher than the the Australian-born population. And that's quite unusual. But it meant part of that is a result of recruiting international students to stay, right? And that made Australia attractive. And lastly, government educational trade promotion facilitation. So study in Australia campaigns, websites, fairs, etc. This sort of government promotion for the sector. Now, all of that was aimed at growing the number of students in Australia and then the amount of Australian activity in other countries by universities. That was seen as a win-win situation. The students benefit by being able to study in Australia, whether they stay in Australia if they want to or if they can, or if they go home, they're taking home qualifications that will help with their careers. They're helping their home countries to develop. It's knowledge transfer and Australia's contribution to the region, etc. It promotes business links over time. It promotes government-to-government benefits. So it's seen as a win-win situation for all of the stakeholders involved. Yeah. And the only limitation was scale. Like the bigger we can make this, the better. Right? The more students that can benefit, the better we are. And that was the situation for decades, this framework. But not just in Australia. In that sort of ways, it's similar to those other big destination countries. Okay, and so this is what's happened to enrolments over that time. So you see this chart, the dark or the blue shaded area is enrolments in the Australian system. So you can see now we have about 1.6 million students in Australia. Just for scale, Australia has a population of 25 million people, right? So small compared to Japan, 1/5 of the size of Japan. Yeah, it's about the size of the Osaka region. Yeah, and the red line there is international students. So you see up until the mid-1980s, very few students, but then once there was that liberalisation of enrolment fees and so on, the number of students grew fairly steadily, yeah, with a few little ups and downs, but fairly steadily up to the time of COVID in 2019. For most of that period, for the last 20 years, international students have been about a quarter or more of the university population in Australia. Between 25 and 30% of students in Australia are international students, which is big. So it's one of the most internationalized systems in the world in terms of the proportion of international students. I think only Switzerland is higher, or Luxembourg, yeah, small countries with lots of students nearby. And you see at the top that those dots are the number of staff in the system. So 120,000 academic and professional staff in universities. Okay. And so if we look at the universities, there's 40 universities in Australia. And what we can see here is the number of enrolments, which is the height of the bars. And so you see that on the left, there's 4 big universities which have around 70,000 students. That's Melbourne, Monash, Sydney, University of New South Wales. So the 2 biggest universities in Melbourne, one of which is my university, University of Melbourne, and the 2 biggest in Sydney. Right? Big institutions. And for that black part there is the number of international students in Australia onshore. That's not including students overseas in branch campuses that some universities have. And the red dot is the proportion of international students. So you can see this line here is about 40%. So my university, University of Melbourne, I think now is about 45% of the students are international at my university. Sydney last year just hit 50% or 51% of students at the University of Sydney are international students. So that's big, right? Around more than 30,000 international students in one institution. And so what's interesting here is some of the biggest universities are the most internationalized. They also, as I'll show later, the most research-intensive universities, the highest ranked universities in global research rankings. Okay, but you can see across the board, nearly every university has international students enrolled, but at different scales.
Just a minute.
Yeah.
Chris, where is that Australian National University?
Australian National University, ANU, it's smaller.
University in the country, and I want to know the percentage of
It's here. Can you see that there? Yeah.
It's about
It's smaller university. So it's about just over 20,000 students.
I see.
And about what 25% international students. What's that? It's
1/4 of the total.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah. So it says ANU is a smaller university. It's in Canberra, which is our capital city. But Canberra is a small city. Population of Canberra is maybe 800,000 people. Yeah. It's research intensive, but has fewer students. Yeah. And so in terms of research ranking, ANU is highly ranked, but it's a small university. Yeah. Yeah.
It is the 1/4 of the total or just half of the total?
At ANU,
ANU.
it's about 25% international students.
It's 1/4 of the total.
1/4, yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. Oh, hang on. Yeah, right.
It's half?
Mm,
Okay, I'll check.
yeah, we can check that later.
Okay, I was there. That's the reason why I'm interested in the data.
Yeah, okay.
I
But
mean,
no, this is the national data from that year. So that'd be right. So it is, yeah, 40% international students. Yeah.
Okay.
So in that way, it's the same as the other research intensive universities over here. Yeah, but smaller scale. Yeah. Okay. And the universities with the small universities, a smaller number of students tend to be regional universities outside of the big cities. Yeah. Okay. And what that doesn't include is offshore. I'll move that up there. Can I click OK here?
Yeah.
So offshore campuses. So there's about another perhaps 100,000 students enrolled offshore in overseas campuses of Australian universities. The biggest is in RMIT. So RMIT's campus in Ho Chi Minh City has around 10,000 students. It's the biggest private university in Vietnam, and one of the most expensive institution in Vietnam as well. It was established in around 2000. Monash University has a campus in Malaysia that was established around the same time, and a few of the others. more recently, Indonesia has opened to overseas campuses, and both Monash and Deakin University have, in the last year, set up campuses in Indonesia, and India also has just opened to international campuses, and Deakin and Wollongong are there, and others soon will set up campuses. So at different stages of development, but the most successful of them, RMIT and Monash, have a significant role in Australia's international relations. Right? So RMIT is the biggest Australian enterprise in Vietnam, right? The biggest Australian organisation. There are no companies, Australian companies, that are bigger. And so for the Australian government, when it's representing Australian organisations and staff and so on, RMIT is the biggest kind of constituency in Vietnam of Australia. So when the Australian Prime Minister or senior leaders go to Vietnam, they visit the campus of RMIT because it's a significant part of the bilateral relationship now. And many students move back and forwards between those two campuses. So it's seen as quite a success, both politically and economically. And that university, just as an aside, because these universities don't generate, the campuses don't generate much revenue for Australia because they don't make a lot of surplus. But if they do, in some cases, they're not able to repatriate those funds. They can't send those funds home. So RMIT Vietnam is sitting on something like $20 million of accumulated funds that it is investing in research and other projects and things, PhD scholarships and so on. So some of those campuses have been quite successful in that terms over the time. All right, so that's to give a sense of the time. I haven't spoken here about student mobility and exchange, but that's similarly on a very large scale. Most universities in Australia have hundreds of exchange partners. It's very common for undergraduate students to do a semester abroad or study tours and so on. They have lots of incoming exchange students and so on. So they're quite internationalized in all sorts of ways. The research tends to be quite internationalized with lots of overseas links. But I'm not going to talk about research too much in this presentation. I'm mainly going to focus on students and the education side of things. Okay. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like in practice in one university. So this is my university at Melbourne, over 70,000 students. So it's a large university. Melbourne's a bit unusual in the mix at undergrad and postgrad. It has half of our students are at graduate level and half undergrad. And that was a deliberate strategy from about 15 years ago to encourage generalist undergraduate, to create generalist undergraduate degrees and encourage students to do professional masters. And most of the international students are also studying at postgraduate level, which is part of that balance. And so you see there are 45% international students. One thing that's not on here that's important for this discussion is that the majority of those international students are from China, over half. And that would be the case at most of those large, highly ranked universities. Most of the students are from China. Because Chinese students tend to make decisions on the basis of rankings. So they prefer highly ranked universities, even though the tuition fees are much higher, right? So Melbourne, Monash, Sydney, UNSW, University of Queensland, tuition fees are very high and they have a majority of Chinese students, right? And this is a challenge for them. As they increase their fees, the number of Chinese students isn't affected, but the number of students from other countries goes down because Chinese students have more capacity to pay high fees, right? Because of family structures, a lot more grandparents and fewer children. So there's families investment in children. There's a high value placed on education in Chinese society, compared with India, where students very few students in India have that sort of money to pay those high fees, right? So this is a challenge for those institutions about where the source countries for their students, as I'll come to in a minute. Okay. All right. So the first challenge, that's setting the scene really, trade exposure. So for about 15 years or more, there's been a concern about financial dependence on international students. And many people say our universities are spending too much time focusing on international students. They should be focusing on domestic students, right? They're chasing money and revenue rather than education, etc. What happens if there's a, I don't know, international currency crisis? What happens if there's a pandemic? What happens if there's a conflict? They will be in big trouble because the students will stop coming, right? So there's a sense that the domestic education system is secure and stable. International student world, whether it's campuses or students coming to Australia, is volatile, right, and unpredictable, and there's anxiety about that. In particular, in relation to China. So I'll talk about both those things, the general concern and the China concern. All right, so this is if we look at the whole of the higher education system or the universities system, those 40 universities, this is the total revenue of the sector, where the money comes from to fund the system. So you see the largest part is from Australian government grants. Government gives grants for subsidies for domestic students, research grants, other funds of various kinds. Yeah, it's about a third of the revenue. But then a quarter of the revenues for international students. That kind of makes sense because a quarter of the students are international students. So the students are paying their way, yeah, and funding the system equivalent to the proportion of the student body. And domestic students are 20%. Yeah. Futal.
Can I ask one more question in terms of, I mean, one of the characteristics is investment income.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So the universities are financially quite autonomous, so they can invest their surplus in, I don't know, stocks and bonds and investments of various kinds.
Is the income from the university hospital included?
Yeah, no, not operating surplus. So if they have a hospital that makes a profit, that would be not investment income. It would be money from capital investment in share markets and so on.
So in the case of your university, University of Melbourne,
yeah,
roughly speaking,
yeah,
the income from your university hospital.
Oh,
of the
yeah, I'm not sure. The university hospital is probably set up as a separate business, not part of the university. It's a separate, yeah, I think so.
The reason why I ask question because since 2004, it is to be more precise, since the 1st April 2004, all national universities have become national university corporations.
Right,
and
in Japan,
year,
yeah.
The amount of Japanese government grants has been cut
right
by 1% every year. And if you look at the homepage of my university, Hiroshima University, can see the amount of income coming from university hospital.
Right.
Has surplus.
Yeah.
The amount of government budget. So that's the reason why.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I don't think it would be that. I think that would be like business operating surplus from there. It would probably be an other revenue, right, on this. So some universities have endowments, they call them in America. We don't call them endowments, but accumulated investments. So let's say tens of millions of dollars sitting in an account, invested in various places, that generates each year a few $1 million. It goes up and down depending on the year. So this seems like a lot to me. 7% is a lot because many universities don't have much at all invested. The older universities like Melbourne, Sydney do have big investments, but typically the way it will work is if I donate $100,000 to the university when I die, it will go into a pot and it'll be called the Zigurus Fund for whatever, the Zigurus Scholarship. And each year, $50,000 of that investment will fund a scholarship for a student. Yeah? Now that's investment income that's used for scholarships and other things within the universities, but it's counted as a separate investment bucket. The university can't spend my $100,000; they can only take the return from that. So that sort of thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, but you can see that for international education is a significant part of the size of the system. If students stopped coming, like if all of a sudden a quarter of the revenue would close, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of jobs. That's tens of thousands of people's jobs which would cease. The students would be stuck in other countries, etc. And so it could be seen as a vulnerability of the system in a time of volatility. Yeah. Oops. Okay. And so if we look at that, the same sort of data about revenue, but by institution. So again, these are the 40 Australian universities. And you can see this is in billions of Australian dollars. So there's about 100 yen to the dollar at the moment. So this is the University of Sydney's revenue is about 400 billion yen. Yeah. So it's huge enterprises, right? With big turnover. But you can see there's 5 universities at the top, the biggest universities. They also have the highest fees. So the international student revenue is big. And I added it up. Overall, the revenue from international students is about $12 billion to universities. $6 billion is earned by those 5 universities. So 5 universities earn half of the international student revenue. The other 35 earn the other half, right? So that creates a big political tension in Australia, where when people complain about universities being too focused on international students and the fees, they're talking about those big 5 universities, right? They are also, as I mentioned, the big research-intensive universities, but they're also the establishment universities in those cities, in Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane. They were established in the 1850s. They have beautiful buildings and grounds. Most of the prime ministers and the senior political leaders in the business went to those universities, right? And so there's a sense that those universities are too exposed, in particular those ones, right? And you can imagine, even amongst the other universities, they're annoyed, right? They're annoyed that Melbourne and Sydney and others have too many international students. Why are you being so greedy? Let us have some students, yeah? Yeah, and remember also that those big 5 universities are predominantly Chinese students, right? And that's where the Chinese students are concentrated in those big institutions. So it's that domestic unevenness is a big part of the story, right? Okay, and then just to show the impact of that. This is from the Shanghai World University Rankings, so research rankings of universities. This is the top 5 Australian universities in the Shanghai rankings. It's the same 5 universities. Yeah. So again, Melbourne, Monash, Sydney, UNSW, and Queensland. Those 5. And so what they've done, those 5 universities over the last 20 years, is had a kind of a virtuous cycle of flow of funds. They invest a lot in research in order to move up the global rankings. As they move up the global rankings, they become more attractive, particularly to Chinese students, and they generate more research, more funds from international education, and they invest that money back into research, right? So there's been this cyclical, the flow of students has invested in research, and so they've moved up and up and up the global rankings. So they're very research intensive. Other Australian universities don't have nearly as much money for research. And the government in Australia is not very generous in funding research, right? And these universities also receive most of the Australian government funding, right? Because they are the most competitive, they have the biggest research centres and so on. Yeah. So there's a real sense of inequality within the Australian system that the government has been trying to, there's been a lot of pressure on the government to do something about this inequality. Yeah. Okay, the second part of this financial risk, right, is exposure to China, right? And particularly in those 5 big universities. Right? So this is just a chronology of some of the major events in the bilateral economic relationship between Australia and China. Um, so from the relationship has been rocky between Australia and China, as between Japan and China. It goes up and down, depending on the times. Um, so in 2016, 2017, there was a period of very bad relationship when Australia criticised, China and said you need to abide by the International Court of Justice. You need to withdraw from the South China Sea. The Chinese government got very angry with Japan and Australia and the US, who all made that statement. Then things got better in 2017. Later in 2017. Australian Prime Minister made a speech warning about Chinese influence in the region, right? Which wasn't, he said it was a negative influence in the region. That made things worse. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT, in 2017, warned Chinese international students in Australia not to engage in politics, right? And there was a concern about Chinese students' political influence, which I'll talk about a bit later on as well. Then Huawei was banned from Australia's 5G network, etc. It got so it improved a bit when in 2018, the Australian Trade Minister visited China. Things improved, got better. And then again in 2020, things got bad when Australia criticised China's response to the COVID vaccine. China wasn't letting international inspectors into Wuhan. Australia called for a World Health Organization inquiry into where this disease came from. China got very furious with Australia because Australia was one of the first countries to call for an international investigation. Yeah. And then in that year, after Australia did that, there was a series of punishments by the Chinese government, banning coal, barley, etc., etc. So you can imagine during 2020, during each of those periods of bad relationships, the Australian universities got very scared, right? If this relationship goes worse, what's going to happen to all our students? And the term that was often used was that the fear that China would turn off the tap, right? China would stop students from traveling to Australia, right? And that would be a big challenge to Australia, the institutions. Now that didn't happen. It hasn't happened, I should say. It could happen any day. But China has warned at various points, warned Chinese students, Australia is not safe. There's racism against Chinese people in Australia. Be very careful. Parents, you should be nervous about sending your children there, etc. In some ways, they're a warning to Chinese students, but they're a warning to Australia. We can stop the students coming to Australia if you are not careful, right? Hasn't happened yet. But it could again. And so, of course, now the fear is if China tries to take Taiwan, which I think a lot of people in Australia would expect is going to happen soon. If I was Xi Jinping, I would do that while Donald Trump is in office, right? Because America is a mess, right? And take advantage of that mess and act quickly. And what's Donald Trump's view is about spheres of influence, yeah? Taiwan is China's sphere of influence. Why should America get involved in helping? And so it would put Australia and Japan in a very difficult situation. The relationship with China would probably get bad. We don't know exactly what would happen, but you can imagine it's not going to be pretty, yeah? And so there's that nervousness now and that vulnerability. Again, there's a concern about exposure to China, how many Chinese students we have. Okay. So that brings me to one of the big responses to this situation, which is about diversification, right? So universities, and particularly those universities with lots of students from China, have been trying to diversify the source countries. Let's recruit more students from Southeast Asia, from India, from the Pacific, and so on, so that, it's an investment strategy, isn't it? You diversify your investment portfolio so that if one return is affected, the other, you have your money in different pots, yeah? In this case, it's not money, it's students. If you're relying on international students, you're a global provider of education. Let's diversify and become more global rather than more focused on China. Now, that worked a little bit for a while. And so my university, for example, had a diversification strategy. It was focused on Southeast Asia and India, etc. And many have. And then after COVID, there was quite a diversification, right? Students from many different countries started coming to Australia in bigger numbers because the economic opportunities in Australia were better, right? Because of the policies the government introduced. In order to attract students back quickly, they uncapped work rights. So instead of international students being able to work 20 hours a week, they were allowed to work as many hours as they liked, right? There was no limit, right? Now that's attractive if you come from a low-income country, right? You can, because Australian wages are much higher than you can earn in Australia. If you can get enough money to get a visa, you can study and work and pay, maybe pay for the cost of your education and living costs in Australia without having to have much money up front. Yeah. And they also extended post-study work rights, which made it much more attractive. So what that did was, these are the change in student numbers from pre-COVID 2019 to post-COVID 2023. So this is in higher education. So what this shows is that there was 12,000 more students from India in 2023 than there was in 2019. So it's a big increase, yeah. During COVID, the numbers went all over the place. Yeah, it was messy. But this is pre and post. Big increases from all those low-income countries. And that was because they could afford to study in Australia now. If they can work full-time and stay longer post-graduation, makes a big difference. And the number of students from China decreased, right? And that's perhaps because I think we're seeing the number of students come out of China to any country is pretty flat these days, I think. And so it tends to move up or down a little bit, but not big changes. So that was successful. Then if you look at vocational education and training, which I haven't talked much about, but I will here, there's an even bigger shift. Again, an extra 12,000 students from India, Philippines, Pakistan, but you see the same thing from low-income countries. And if you come back to what I was talking about before about capacity to pay, students from China tend to pay for high-fee university degrees at research universities. Students from low-income countries are going to low-fee universities, other universities, and to vocational education training providers. So huge increase in enrollments here. And then again, you see on the downturn from higher income countries. All right, so that was good for diversification. Now, what we see here is this chart is a little bit complicated, but it shows the percentage of international students who work, right? Across the bottom is the number who work while they're studying, right? So you'll see on the right-hand side, 80% or 70% of students from Nepal are working while they're studying, as compared with only 10% of students from China are working while they're studying, because they tend to have more family resources. And in China, few students, is expected, I think, for Chinese students that if you're a university student, that's your full-time job. In China, most students are living on campus. They're not working, they're completely dedicated, right? So it's a cultural as well as an economic factors there. On the left, on the vertical axis, we see the percentage who are employed while on a post-study work visa, right? And again, you'll see down there, 55% of Chinese students, this is post-graduation, living in Australia. Only 55% of the Chinese students are working, right? Whereas for students from Nepal, over 90% are working, right? And you can see pretty much what that gradation is GDP per capita or capacity to pay, right? This is an economic measure. So it just kind of explains a little bit why those changes to working conditions attract students from low-income countries, right? So this is, for people like me and others in the sector who are looking at this diversification strategy, who think this is great, this is good, this is actually recruiting people from lower income countries to come to Australia, doing jobs that we need done. and that was working. It's quite successful. But then it's also quite unsustainable. This is, if you look at the rate of growth here, this is Australia and Canada. Students from the Philippines by level of study. So what you can see is very few students studying at university level, right? But a lot studying in colleges. And this is nearly all private colleges, right? Private providers. They're lower quality institutions, typically cheaper tuition fees, but it's an easy way to get a visa, right? And so there was a concern that these students were coming in just to work. They're not real students. They're not genuine students, was the phrase that was used. And the government, so what you may know, in Canada around this time, the Canadian government got very scared at the rapid growth in the number of students, and they stopped issuing student visas all of a sudden, right? A complete stop. Australia panicked as well after that. When they saw that Canada had stopped issuing visas, they thought, oh no, all those students are going to come here now as well. We've already got a huge bulge, right? We need to quickly stop. And so they pretty much, from that point, they tightened the student visa policy dramatically, particularly for students from low-income countries, so India, Nepal, Philippines, and particularly in vocational education training providers. So that diversification was very quick, but stopped, right? And now we're back in the situation we were before. So just to give you a sense of where the students are from now in terms of that diversification risk. On the left, there is higher education. You can see a third of the higher education students in the country are from China, right? But in those big five institutions, the majority are from China, right? And then India, Nepal, Vietnam, Pakistan, etc. Now the challenge is how to diversify and without losing significant revenue. On the right-hand side is vocational, the rest of the students in the other levels, so mainly vocational education training. And sorry, the colors are different there, which is not helpful. But you see it's more diversified in vocational education training, but more lower income students there. But few students from China in vocational education training. Okay. So what's happened is that you have this diversification strategy has been pushed historically by the Department of Education, right, and Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, concerned about geopolitical risks. That got overshadowed by a concern about immigration numbers, right? The numbers of students coming in are too big, right? And that increase in students was nearly all from low-income countries. So when they stopped more students from low-income countries. I'll come back to that in a second. All right. But let's move on now to national security. And really, since around the same period, since 2010, more or less, there's been a lot of concern about foreign influence, right? So far we've talked about financial risks, yeah. Now we're talking about security risks. And again, the concern has been about China, right? Really. And so this is going back, I mentioned this before. Julie Bishop was our foreign minister, and she warned both Chinese students in Australia, but also the party, the Chinese Communist Party, to be careful about your political activities on campus in Australia. So, as quoted there, there's a widespread perception amongst universities, other actors, governments, and so on, that the Chinese government was working with student groups to monitor both Chinese students in Australia, but also to be active in domestic political issues that were related to China, but happening in Australia. So there was, for example, when there was lots of protests about the treatment of Uyghur people in Western China. There were protests in Australia, and there'd be pro-Chinese protests as well, which were mainly Chinese students who were supported by the Chinese government of those protests, pro-Chinese protests. And a number of issues like that happening. Yeah. And so there was nervousness on campus. University leaders are nervous about if we have guest speakers, do we invite the Dalai Lama to come and speak at our campus or not, right? That may result in the Chinese government deciding that students should not be able to come to our university anymore, and that would be catastrophic if we didn't have Chinese students. Similarly with, yeah, and now the tension in Australia is about Israel-Palestine, and again, concerns about freedom of expression on campus. There's anti-Semitism and so on, which is really fraught. But in part, it's very clear that that Israeli government and Jewish community in Australia are putting a lot of pressure on Australian universities to restrict freedom of expression and restrict protests, right? And so there's a sense, hang on, this is foreign interference. This is the Israeli government interfering in the domestic issues of Australian universities, etc. So that's been a concern, right? So that's from 2017. And then in 2019, partly as a result of that, the government put in place some guidelines to counter foreign influence, right? And this was quite a high-profile issue. It was during one of those periods where the Australia-China relationship was tense. Yeah, China's never mentioned here in any of the government documents, right? It's about foreign influence generally. We're not saying who we're concerned by, but it was pretty clear to everybody that the major concern was China. Yeah. And you can see there the examples of risks of foreign influence, which are described. So it's interference in research, sensitive and personal data. So a lot of concerns about cybersecurity. And this is a period where Australian universities were under cyber attack constantly, right? Phishing influence. There were some leaks of data from some universities. When that happened, the government and others would get very furious with those universities, because they would say, we knew that we were targets, right? Lots of partnerships, collaborations, etc. And again, that cybersecurity issue about intellectual property, commercialization, patents, sensitive research, and so on. Okay. And then undue influence of an agenda within or outside the classroom. So there was concern amongst some commentators that academics were being very careful about the topics that were being discussed in class, because they didn't want to talk about any issues in social sciences, any issues that would make Chinese students feel uncomfortable, right? And so they would steer away from all sorts of human rights issues and so on. I think personally, I think there's probably a bit of self-censorship, but I think that tends to happen all the time. The same with the Israel-Palestine issue. Most academics want to not talk about that because this is not what we're here for. We're here to study biology or something, so let's avoid those topics, right? But definitely the universities were avoiding topics for public presentations, guest speakers, and so on sensitive issues. Now, around that time, there was also concern about Australian academics travelling to China and other countries, and a much greater scrutiny for travel approvals. There were some Australian academics who were, I think an academic from University of Technology Sydney, who was a Chinese background academic, who was imprisoned in China, and there was no contact with him for a long time, for months, right? So that university was very concerned. One of their academic staff was in China and couldn't leave. Yeah. My university had an academic, a researcher in anthropology, I think, who was traveling in Iran. She was arrested and accused of spying and locked in jail for, I think, a couple of years. She was in jail in Iran because her husband was Israeli. And so it was a way for Iran to have basically an Israeli hostage who was an academic from the University of Melbourne. And so the university started being very careful about where are you going and is there any risk of you, but particularly affected Chinese background academics traveling to China, because the university was concerned just to make sure, and they would check with the intelligence agencies in Australia, do you know anything about this academic? Have you heard anything in China that makes us think that this academic might be a risk in China? We need to be careful, right? So there was an effort to protect their staff who, from those things, and a lot of contact in this period between Australian universities and the intelligence agencies. Quite frequent briefings on a monthly basis. All the international directors of the universities in Zoom meetings with the intelligence and Department of Education heads in Canberra. This is what we know. Here's some updates on cyber attacks. Here's some updates on things that we've heard. Watch out for this, etc. So quite close coordination between intelligence agencies and university international offices over that period. Okay. And so what that looks like from the position of an academic like me, is compulsory training on international risks. Yeah. So this is a course that I had to complete at the University of Melbourne. You see there's a 20-minute, the duration's 20 minutes. It's part of our compliance training. When we start at the university, every staff member has to do all this sort of training in the rules of the university and the policies. And this is one. Just to increase awareness amongst the things that could happen, right? And how to be careful about data, but also about being, fraudulent, people taking advantage, pretending they're someone who they're not, you sending them a whole lot of information, etc. And there's a foreign disclosure requirement. So every year I have to fill in a little online form and I have to talk about all of the international links I have. If I'm receiving money from another university, another organization in another country, who am I receiving money from? And generally, I work in international education, so I have lots of international links. I kind of declare all these things. I've never heard anything back, right? There hasn't been any concern about that, but I think in some of those relationships have to be reported to the federal government. And any significant relationship that the university has to be reported to the federal government. And so the Foreign Affairs Department have more visibility of what the universities are doing in different parts of the world. This is new from about the last 10 years or less, last 8 years, yeah. Okay, so and lastly, I'll talk about uncontrolled growth and then I'll stop. So we talked about financial risk, security risk, and now we're talking about immigration, really. The fear that the numbers of international students will grow too quickly and that's a threat, a risk to Australia. Okay. So going back to COVID, this is Alex Hawke, who was the Minister for, what was it, Immigration, Citizenship, Migrant Services, etc., post-COVID. And at that time, this is 2022, press release, media release, saying we welcome the return of international students. We've put all these policies in place to encourage the students to come back as quickly as possible. We need them. There was lots of labour shortages in Australia. Every shop had a sign, workers wanted, right? Lots of organisations were short of staff because we have a big temporary resident population. The students had all left. We need the students back because we don't have enough people, to work. And so that was a deliberate strategy to increase it. This is what happened. So you see that press release was from 2022, kind of at this dip here. The numbers of students bounced back quite quickly. So the black bar there is international student visa holders. So you can see at the peak in 2024, there was over 700,000 students in Australia in international student visas. That's out of a population of 25 million, right? So that's a significant part of the population. Plus this number of students on post-study work visas. So another, 200,000. So nearly 900,000 students or graduates in the country on temporary visas. So that's about 1 in 25 people in Australia is an international student, right? That's a big part of the population. But that rate of growth was very fast, right? So many more students arriving than leaving. And if you look back pre-COVID, this is the rate of growth that we're used to. It was about 6 to 8% a year on average of gradual increase of the number of students. That was manageable because there's more student accommodation being built, more housing, etc. This was a rapid growth that was causing concern. And then in 2024, the opposition, the Conservative Party, I have to say, it's the same party that was in power in 2022 who wanted to bring international students back. They lost an election. They were in opposition. Then they said, the government has lost control of migration. There's too many students flooding in. It's a disaster. And in the same way that in the United Kingdom and in America, the right-wing political parties have been very anti-immigration, very nationalistic. And so the opposition parties in Australia became very anti-immigration, right? And very anti-international students in particular, as part of an election campaign. They saw that it had worked for Donald Trump and that it worked in Brexit, and they thought that it could be a successful strategy in Australia. And they put a lot of pressure on the government to reduce international student numbers. And what they were focused on was the net overseas migration rate, the NOM, right? And this statistic had not been a part of Australian political life in the past, right? But it became something that everybody knew, this NOM, right? This figure that was concerned. And it's the year-on-year change in the population. So it's pretty much the number of people arriving in the country minus the number of people leaving. So, and you can see back before COVID, it's fairly stable, at around 250,000 people a year. Our migration intake for scale, the permanent migration program is around 200,000 people a year, new residents for long-term migrants. So, but many of those are students who are in the country already. So 250,000 people a year additional to the country we can cope with, right? Because Australia has a low birth rate, like Japan and many other countries now. We're not having many babies. So in some ways, we need migration just to keep the population level. Big dip during COVID, but then this rate here, where there's over 500,000 people arriving in the past 12 months, that's huge, right? And the Conservative Party said, this is a disaster. They blamed this for inflation, right? Inflation in many countries spiked after COVID, and caused political problems in many countries. In Australia, conservative groups blamed that on international students and said international students are to blame, all our costs going up, the housing costs going up, a housing shortage and so on. And so the government very quickly tried to reduce international student numbers, and that's the situation we're in now. And just to return to this became very significant, right? The number of students at those big five universities, the amount of revenue and so on. The government really started to try and attack those universities and criticizing them publicly, right? Which created this kind of crisis in the sense that universities are behaving really badly. But those universities, but also the vocational education and training providers, the private colleges, they really were attacked as well. Okay, so what they've done since then, it's just in the last couple of years. And you see on the right-hand side, this is the number of student visas or applications. The number of applications is dropping now as a result. Fewer students want to come to Australia and fewer visas are being issued, right? So the number of students is declining. They've done that both by demand measures and supply measures. By demand measures that make Australia less attractive, right? So fewer people will want to come. They've increased student visas from X to Y. Sorry, I was meant to put numbers there. From about $300 for student visa. That's 30,000 yen, I think, up to $2,000. right? So an Australian student visa now is the most expensive in the world to get a student visa. And the government said, well, we don't mind, because students who can afford to study and who have high incomes and plenty of money, they will still come here. It's the students who can't afford to come that will be affected. So students from Nepal, India, Philippines, and so on, low-income countries, that diversification countries, they won't come, and that's okay. And so it's a focus on revenue rather than high quality, high income students, etc. They reduce post-study work rights to make it less attractive to students as well. They've tightened visa eligibility, and they've put caps on each provider. So each university now has a quota of the number of students that they can enroll, right? And the government is proposing to manage the numbers from this point on, for all sorts of reasons. And so the situation we're in now is that the government is forcing a slower rate of growth of international students, either at a steady state or a very slow rate, to avoid those big peaks in net overseas migration. Because in a market area, the government can't control that. They can't control how many students are going to want to come. Very well. Okay, and so they're using these allocations of places to achieve a whole lot of political objectives, or to try. We don't know yet if they can actually do this, and they don't know, but this is what they're talking about, right? So what they want to do, they want to move international students, less concentration in those 5 universities, move them to other universities, to other regions, right? There's lots of students in Melbourne and Sydney. There's not many in Adelaide, Perth, Hobart. We want to encourage students to move there. We can reduce the quotas in those cities and increase the quotas in other cities. This might work. They want to incentivize provision of student accommodation. If you build student housing, you'll have more places. If you don't, you're already left, etc. And there's a political difference here in that the Labor Party wants to focus on public universities, right, and reduce the number of students in private colleges using the visa system. The Conservative parties, which are pro-business, they're quite happy for the private colleges to have lots of students in the private sector, right? And they're not as connected with public universities. So the danger is that when we have different parties in power, they will use these quotas for political purposes, right? If there's a university in their electorate that they want to get more votes because there's a by-election, they might promise to give more allocations to this university. If there's I don't know, you might have these kind of political party biases coming into the allocation of students, and there's a real worry about that, politicization of student numbers. It's not good for students either, because students now are not, they're more constrained in where they can go. Before, it was pretty much financial constraints and, grades and entry requirements. Now, more and more, there's a supply constraint on students. And lastly, they can use these quotas to preference students from particular countries. So Pacific Island state students are exempt from the quotas now. They don't count. And Timor-Leste, East Timor. But there's been calls by universities, if you want to encourage students from Southeast Asia, why don't you exempt Southeast Asia from these quotas, right? The problem with doing that is then really the quota only applies to China and India, right? And then China and India will get upset and say, well, hang on, why are you restricting us but no one else, etc. So the government's created a lot of political problems by micromanaging the sector. Okay, and lastly, we have intense competition between providers for the share of allocations. So in the past, the way you got more international students is by providing better quality education, having better services, better marketing and recruitment, reducing your fees, more scholarships. Now the way you get more international students is by lobbying government for a bigger allocation, right? It's a very different environment. Okay. All right, so conclusions, and I'll be quick. So now the export orientation, so that market orientation is much less significant in public policy in Australia because we're in an era where supply is constrained. There's a sense that we pretty much hit the limit in the number of international students we can accommodate, or close to the limit. But there's excess demand. There's plenty of students out there who want to study in Australia. We don't need to put lots of money into market development strategies, recruitment. So instead, there's a tension now between two different strategic objectives. One objective is to diversify, to reduce the risk of exposure to China, right? Largely, that's the concern. Diversify by recruiting students from all these other regions, right? Now that comes at a cost. The students are paying lower tuition fees and they are going to work more. But some people see that as a bad thing. And the immigration department sees that as a bad thing. The immigration department wants high-income students who pay the most fees, so etc. And the managed growth approach. So the managed growth approach led by the immigration department is focusing on quality rather than quantity. And then largely, for the large universities, like my university, when you have a capped number of students, it makes that diversification strategy more difficult, right? Let's say the average fee is $50,000 a year, and we have lots of Chinese students who can afford that. If we want to recruit students from India or from the Philippines, we're going to have to issue scholarships and subsidies and discounts, right? So if we replace one Chinese student with one Indian student, our revenue is going to drop, right? And so it's not we can't grow our way to be more diverse anymore. We have to make trade-offs. And then there's an incentive for the universities to try and maximize the revenue per student if the numbers are constrained. And so that's the bind that the universities are in now in Australia. Right, so I hope that's been useful. It's complicated, but hopefully there's some simplicity there as well. But yeah, looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your